right, you don't need to hear from me. Let's go right to the interview with Mark Verbos. Here we go. All right, this week we are talking to a person I've known for a long time. I consider him a friend, if nothing else. He's a guy that I've always been able to share jokes with when we meet up at trade shows or whatever. But he's a phenomenal talent in the inventing in the modular world. His name's Mark Verbos. And he has set the world abuzz with a new set of modules for the Eurorack system. We're going to hopefully talk about all that stuff. Hey, Mark, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks a lot for taking the time out to talk to us. I'd like to start off by just having you kind of explain what you do and give us a little bit of background about how you got there.
Okay. Well, as you've already mentioned, right now I'm going around the world introducing my new line of Eurorack modules. But the genesis of all this is that I've been, for the last 20 or so years, working as a recording engineer and as a musician myself, and slowly becoming more and more of a music equipment engineer or designer. And the way that happened really was that I started out making my own music as a teenager, electronic music particularly, and then I went to school for recording engineering at Full Sail in Florida. And then right around the time that I came back, I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Of course, you know that, but maybe no one else does.
Right.
Around the time that I came back, as I guess 19 or 20-year-old, I met Grant Richter, who at the time, who's pretty well known to the DIY community and also known for the stuff he does now with Moleco, but he was in the process of creating his own new modular system in the mid-90s when nobody was making new modulars. And because he was from a generation before me and a really sort of serious electrical engineer, classically trained, but also a musician, he kind of became a mentor to me in this kind of thing. And at the time, he was the king of repairing the old Buchla systems, which there aren't that many of them, but if somebody had one, generally he was doing the repairs on it. And somewhere along the line, through what I learned from him and whatever kind of torch passing happened, somewhere along that line, I became, 10 years after that, became the guy who was fixing all the Buchla systems. And that launches us forward to today, where I'm trying to take some of what Don Buchla did back in the day, some of the things that I've done with that system to sort of fill in the holes with my own ideas and work to make things that work with Buchla systems, bring all these ideas together as well as some of my fresh ideas and bring them into the Eurorack format, which is really exploding right now. Last I heard is something like 80 manufacturers. So it's a big buzz.
Right, indeed. Well, that's a really interesting background because it kind of, on one hand, it flies all over the map, and on the other side, it sort of looks like you had planned this all along, even though I'm sure that's not how it feels in real life. So let's first of all talk about your background as both a performer and recording engineer. I know that way back when I was in Milwaukee, you were really active in the electronic music scene. In fact, I think the first time we met, you were advertising in the paper looking for analog synths. I had an old MC-202 that I was trying to move to a new home, and we struck a deal over that. But I remember talking to you, and you were very excited about the electronic music thing, and you seemed to be sort of like really embracing that. How did you move from electronic music into wanting to do recording engineering? Did it seem natural, or was it something where you were trying to make a career given what you were interested in?
I think the way that happened was because as a child, I was raised as a musician, playing instruments and in school taking classes about music and music theory and whatever. And at some point, it became clear to me that I'd rather be making my own music than performing someone else's music. And as I got more into recording, I had bands and my own electronic stuff. As I got more into recording it, I just wanted to be able to do it all myself. So it seemed to me that as a teenager, I don't think I really knew what a producer or an engineer did, but it seemed to me that I had to be one of those or both of those in order to do it all myself. So I just wanted to be exposed to all of that, to the equipment and to the techniques for how to record. And when I got out of school, then I went on to work as an intern and then assistant engineer and then engineer in a kind of big-time mainstream studio in Chicago, and ultimately came to the conclusion that maybe that wasn't what I wanted to do. But it's a good tool set, and I've always, while I was in school, I learned a little bit about repairing gear and about reading schematics and that kind of stuff. And I was always interested in that stuff, and I always kind of thought that the process of recording music, the process of making electronic music, and the process of building electronic instruments is all pretty closely related.
So how did the work with Grant and the recording studio stuff, how did that mesh in time? I mean, because I think, I'm trying to put together the time frames in my head, and I know that I would meet you at AES in New York, and you were heavily involved in the recording studio stuff at that point. But I also remember at some period of time when you were working with Grant, you were also really active in designing your own kind of mini systems. You were doing little sequencers and stuff like that, just kind of for your own use as well. How did those line up in terms of time? Did you work with Grant before or after or during the recording studio period?
All of these things kind of happened on top of each other, but but I when I came back from school in '95, I guess, I knew that I wanted to build synthesizers. I had a few books and I had a little bit of information, and I was following around on the internet on some of the lists and stuff, but I wasn't equipped to really do it. There were some parts of the process that were still a mystery. And when I actually bought this EMS Putney from an 80-year-old man, and it didn't work. And I attempted to fix it and wasn't successful. And then somebody gave me Grant's phone number saying, "This is a guy who can fix this."
Right.
So I called him without ever having met him, just cold called him, and he immediately said, "No, I don't fix." He said, "I don't fix stuff anymore. I learned my lesson on that." And then he couldn't resist. He said, "Wait, where are you getting this stuff? Just bring it over. I hate to see these things not working." So, when I got to his place and I went into the basement and saw a museum of electronic music, the Buchlas and a big Surge and R2600 and EML stuff and Putney and a Synthy and just on and on and on, it became clear that this was the guy that was going to expose me to a lot of things that I never would have had the opportunity to get near. And then he pulled out his prototypes of what he was putting together that would become what he was calling Wiard then, but then ultimately came Wired.
Right.
But and that was the transition where things like how do you make a circuit board? Finally, there was an answer to that question because he was somebody who was doing it. So it became a thing where then I started to do my own, and when they didn't work, I could always go to him as a sort of safety net. And in that process, I think you and I were both kind of guiding him in what he was putting together,
right? Telling
him there's no way that somebody making techno would ever use it that way,
right.
or what, trying to get him out of his technique for making music and more toward ours. And we were all learning at the same time, and he had a lot more formal training in electronics, obviously, since that was what he'd studied, and he was working at that time. I think he was designing a metal detector for somebody,
right?
But he just enabled me, and also my friend Gabe Catanzaro, who was at the time studying at MyEd. He was going into the labs at the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, going into the labs and building enclosures. So I would build the electronics, and Gabe would build these boxes with folding up plastic to create boxes or metal or whatever. And Grant would always be there to save me when I got in over my head. So it was a little bit at a time, but during that time when I was over there a lot, I was there was a year or so in maybe 95, 96 when I was living in Milwaukee and going over to his place all the time to either bring something of mine that didn't work to be fixed or solder wires onto pots for him or whatever. And then I started working in a recording studio in Chicago, and I was up there all the time, back and forth between Milwaukee and Chicago, always learning more from him. And he has a lot more to offer than just being an electrical engineer. He's also a raconteur of all things underground, and a really sort of quirky, interesting person.
Right. I think it's interesting because I think for as much props as Grant has maybe gotten for his work, I still think it's like there's so much more that people could discover about him. I mean, between his love of modular synths and his love of Vespas and his love of ridiculous old obscure music, I always felt like every time I had an opportunity to spend an hour with him, I would learn something amazing. So he's an incredible guy, and I hope that history treats him appropriately for that.
Yeah, it's a strange thing how the history of electronic music and the history of instrument design is different because of the nature of the technology. That it must have been very, very difficult to find out about a synthesizer in the 70s when there wasn't really anywhere to advertise them. And then now we have the internet, so in a way everybody's a star, but in another way nobody's a star.
Right.
So it's a smaller world than ever, but in some ways it's a bigger world than ever. So he still is a hero to me, and really a trailblazer in the idea of bringing all of this very forgotten technology back to life for musicians. Because for guitar players, the idea of using 50-year-old technology is normal. I mean, pretty much never got past tube amps.
Right.
But for electronic music, there was for a long time a lot of momentum into new, and forget about the old and put it in a closet and never touch it again. And then somewhere, so I don't know when the official turning point is, but somewhere it became acceptable to try out what in some ways is really obsolete ways of doing things, and it's interesting to see a new generation of users cherry pick whatever parts of this stuff they want and package it together in new ways. And what's happening with Eurorack is really interesting because there are some manufacturers that are focused on doing clones or reissues or old style things, but then there are also brands that are only doing modules based on microprocessors and doing things that weren't possible in the 70s.
Right.
And are kind of a fusion of old and new, and creating some new middle ground that is an old way of addressing a new idea or something like that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in fact, this idea of exploring the old as part of kind of a hybrid music development style, it's not just in modular synths. I mean, you see it in recordings. I just had a talk with a student yesterday who is just infatuated with old cassette multi-track decks and their peculiarities, and the tape op crew is very much embracing of a hybrid of old and new. So it is really an interesting time to watch not only electronic music, but music technology in general make that kind of shift. So at some point you moved to New York, which must have been growing up a Milwaukee boy, that must have been a bit of a trip. Did you sort of like bring your music and recording career with you there, or did you start fresh when you got to New York?
Actually, I spent 3 years in Berlin, Germany between.
Oh, okay.
I basically I got to a point in the recording studio working as a staff engineer where I became really frustrated with the work that I was doing. I kind of felt like I was never going to get the great projects, because any great project that came to our studio brought their own engineer.
Right.
And so I was ending up with a lot of the projects that were like the kind that call and ask, how much is your room, per hour? And then when they arrive to the session, they say, wait, there isn't an engineer included? So
right.
then they would, get me. So at some point I said, I can't do this anymore. And I lived in Germany and just did my music and worked on my synthesizers. And really at that time, my own music was my primary focus. But in 2003, I moved to New York, and whatever stuff I had in my dad's basement, equipment-wise, that I didn't take with me overseas, and whatever I had in various places in Chicago and whatever, I packed it all up and brought it to New York, and then set up shop here and started doing engineering and producing, doing a lot of remixes and working with some bands and that kind of thing, in addition to doing my music. And all the while doing the synthesizer building, but as a hobby, really, building my own stuff, but never actually selling anything. And only maybe around 2005 started to do some custom work and do a lot of repairs of Buchla stuff. And that transition more or less happened because I had such a presence in the community on the internet for the followers or the obsessors of the Buchla stuff. Right. And I had experience using it, and I was definitely interested in owning it, but mostly my experience at that point was as far as the electronics were concerned, was with building some of the circuits and modifying some of the ideas, and I had the experience through Grant of seeing a lot of them taken apart and him doing repairs for people and telling me what he was doing and whatever, and I had all of the documents from him. But really, it was around that time also that he decided that he couldn't do the electronics work anymore, at least not the hands-on portion of it.
Right.
He's still doing the design, but he'd gotten to a point where his hands weren't feeling very, very good.
Right. Physically, he was having difficulty doing
it. Yeah. so in a way, he at that point started to pass that work to me because he felt like I could handle it and he didn't want to do it or couldn't do it. So me becoming more of a technician, and not that I ever stopped engineering or that I ever stopped making my own music, but it becoming a bigger part of my life to do the synth designing and synth preparing really just happened kind of naturally. I didn't one day decide, now I'm going to start doing this too, or instead, it just kind of a little bit at a time became a bigger and bigger part of my life.
It seemed like your embrace of the Buchla stuff and the internet sort of coincided in a pretty handy way, because that was the point at which people who had a Buchla system sitting in a closet and wanted to resurrect it actually had a mechanism where they could kind of look around for people to help out. And you really became the go-to Buchla guy, such that not only were you doing repair work, but you were actually developing new modules for Buchla format, right?
That's right.
It seems like kind of an intimidating thing to say, Buchla, he's sort of in many eyes is sort of a master of this kind of stuff. It seems a little intimidating to say, well, and I'm going to put something in a box to sit right next to it. How much did you sort of worry about honoring the goals and the techniques of what Buchla had been doing with his early systems?
It's definitely a concern, and the first time that I had a module not inside of someone else's system, and they had a picture of their cabinet, and it was a Buchla system with one of my modules in the middle, was definitely I guess it's the same kind of thing. It's like sending your kid off to college. You're proud, but you're also a little bit concerned that maybe they're not up to task.
Right.
But the way that it happened really was that I had a client here in New York who has more Buchla modules probably than anybody. He mentioned to me that he was looking around for a 242 programmable pulsar, which, in addition to being probably, if not the rarest, one of the rarest Buchla 200 modules, which doesn't necessarily make it any better, it just makes it rarer. But he's a musician, and he uses his Buchla every day to make music that ends up on TV. He's done themes for TV shows and all sorts of big-time work. We got into the conversation about that module, and I said, it seems crazy to end up spending, at the time, I don't know what amount of money I expected, but I'm sure it would be very expensive, and now much more than then, if you found one to make it yours, and good luck even finding one. But then at the end of the day, it's 12 steps long, it's 3 rows of pulse, like programmable pulses, and there's no reset, and it's a very primitive and sort of not that powerful of a module. And I said, wouldn't it actually be more suitable for what you're trying to do if we just designed the ultimate programmable pulsar that had all the things that you want it to have? Mm-hmm. So at that point, I drew up a sketch about what I thought that might be, and he looked at that sketch and made a couple comments, and then he said, yeah, let's do it. And we made the agreement that I would make one for him and one for me.
Okay.
which I thought was really cool.
Right.
So I made one for him and one for me, and then he put a picture of his system somewhere on the internet, and people started contacting him and asking what that was and could they get one. And then the next thing we knew, I was making 5 of them, and then the next, shortly after that, it was 10, and that was the beginning of it. So the thing that was important to me was that I tried to understand what the philosophical platform that the Buchla 200 was built on is, and tried to match that. Tried to stay in with that. And among the things that are important in the Buchla manifesto are all the signal levels being the same, and the control, all of the parts that are used on the panel from the same really long-standing, high-end brands. Like the switches are all C and K, and the jacks are Johnson banana jacks and Switchcraft audio jacks and all of that stuff. But also that it and that it fits obviously in the case. But like everything about it, matches with the Buchla system. So to build something that maybe was a hole in the system, like something that Don never did. Not to take an idea that Don had and try to one-up him, not to compete with him on building, on trying to show what he did wrong and do it better.
Right.
But, maybe something that wasn't there, that would be nice for a user to have. And so the idea from the beginning wasn't for me to make modules so that you don't have to buy a Buchla, but to make some extra things that could be added to existing Buchlas.
Yeah, well, that's a real interesting point, because when I take a look at the modules that you were kind of responsible for, it did seem to be, if anything, it made the whole system more viable musically. And again, but like in a very reverential way. What do you think Don thought about you doing this?
Well, I talked to Don about it a little bit, and his attitude has always been that he doesn't want to go back. He never wants to repeat anything that he did before, and he wants to always look forward to doing things that are new and more advanced.
Right.
But he, in one conversation that I had where fairly early on in when I was doing this, there was a kind of uproar in the users group about this stuff, and so I got on the phone with him to talk with him about it, and he basically said, "There's nothing I can do about it." So, or I don't want to do anything to you, and there's nothing that I could do, so do whatever you want. But then he turned around and gave me, I don't want to say a lecture because it was actually very polite, but he gave me a lot of pointers or experience stories about what it's like to design things for the music industry and ways of protecting myself against getting ripped off, and
that's awesome.
Recommendations for how to deal with things. And he told me stories about doing weather research for NASA and all kinds of really interesting things. So I think for him, in a way, it was, I can't speak for him, but I think that it was kind of, what I was doing was sort of silly, or like it wasn't interesting, because it was, well, part of it was that he said, the only thing that you have to worry about is an ethical problem. And I thought, oh no. He said, do you think it's ethical to sell people obsolete technology?
Oh, that's interesting.
Which is something that never even had occurred to me.
Right.
I mean, the thinking of mine was that it's ethical to sell people anything that they want to buy.
Right.
So if somebody told you that, if you didn't know anything about guitars, and then someone told you that the amplifier technology that we all prefer is, from the 40s,
right.
he would think that that's crazy, and that there must be a better way of doing it. And
right.
On paper, there's a better way of doing it. Transistors or whatever new digital amplifier techniques or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But the users prefer something that's, from an electrical engineer's side, incredibly obsolete.
Right.
So the most important thing, and Don didn't say this to me himself, but I read it in an interview that he did. He said that kind of paraphrasing, but that the most important thing is to design the instrument panel first, and then make the electronics do whatever you need, because then when the electronics go obsolete, the device itself never will.
Right. That's interesting. That's really great advice. I like how you sort of frame that as Don always wanting to move forward, because I remember even back, when I was hanging around with Grant and playing around with his Buchla system in the basement, I'm like, how could he ever have left this behind? And then you'd look, and it was like, well, you could see he got excited by different technologies that came along, and next thing you know, he's doing the thunder and the lightning, and he's really into like performance movement and stuff like that. You could see that he had a desire to change what he was working on and the way that he was approaching problems. And so he himself sort of has a philosophy that's built around that. A result of all of what you did with the Buchla stuff led to this new series of Eurorack modules that you created, and my God, did you create a storm with that. I mean, first of all, because they're beautiful and they look unlike anything else. Secondly, because you announced it and they were like ready to go that day, which is like so the opposite of not only the modular systems, but the music industry in general. The music industry tends to want to give you 9 months to worry about being the first person to get a thing before, and so all the pre-announcements and the dates for planned shipments and then the revised dates for planned shipments, and you just kind of like blew it up, which was really interesting because it happened just before NAMM, so you were able to get a lot of attention from that too. How much of your Buchla system design experience and background was brought to bear on this, and how much did you sort of have to push yourself in terms of making new module design and new circuit design?
Well, there's no question that modifying my my instincts for how to design something was a bit of a chore, because the power supplies are different, the voltage ranges are different, the ergonomic situation is different. So in a way, it's almost like starting from scratch with a lot of the directions that things have to be taken. And among the things are the fact that in a Buchla system, the smallest module is 7 inches high by 4 1/4 inches wide. And in a Eurorack, the smallest, something could potentially be as small as 1 HP, which is,
a sliver,
1/3 of an inch wide or something.
Right.
So what you find is that in a Buchla system, some of the modules are like, 4 of this, 6 of that.
Right.
A lot of like multiple things where the 281 quad function generator is 4 attack release envelopes in one module, and the low pass gate is 4 low pass gates in one module, and the source of uncertainty 266 is noise and fluctuating random voltages a couple times, and a few different stored randoms, and an integrator and sample and hold, all in this one module. And when you get into Eurorack, you don't really see that kind of thinking. It's more like each of those things is broken up into its own module.
Right.
And part of the Buchla philosophy, or at least by the later 200 series stuff, was to package the building blocks together in such a way that a musician could get to certain techniques just by flipping a switch and introducing a new thing, and have it all doing a lot of the work of getting to that patch already configured behind the scenes, so that it isn't like a laboratory experiment to create the patch.
Right.
And I wanted to bring a lot of that kind of thinking into what I was doing. So the tendency is for my modules to be a bit bigger physically than most of the Eurorack stuff.
Right.
Because of where I'm coming from. But
well, they're bigger, but they're also packaged in interesting combinations, which also seems to be something that you drew from the Buchla design philosophy. So, if we take a look at like your what would be your VCA, It actually has some tone controls, a little resonant filter built in. It's got a nice array of attenuators all available, and so it's really a package that has sort of like a musical entity to it. It's the final piece in a voice, right?
Yeah, and well, as far as the attenuators or reversing attenuators or whatever we call them, I try to put them on pretty much every CV input, because as a modular user, I find that it's really frustrating to not have the ability to scale the voltage coming in. I mean, it just seems like the only solution to me.
Right.
But it doesn't really require much more in the electronics. It's a pretty simple circuit, so you might as well throw it in there anywhere that it might be useful.
Right.
And part of the philosophy, also something that I am drawing from Buchla, is the idea of using different size knobs for different controls, and trying to give you the most obvious control for each module is on a big knob, mm-hmm. and then everything's kind of built around that physically, and try to have kind of a signal flow feel, and just make it so that you can get the patch without thinking of it like a scientist, but right. thinking of it like a musician. And I think that's the biggest thing that I learned from Buchla was to design the front panel, and then after that figure out how to make that circuit, because the other way around doesn't really make sense from a musician's perspective. And
sure.
There are definitely instruments that are designed were more like breadboard experiments that turned into something that had a lot of possibilities. So then they thought, okay, let's just put jacks for all of these things.
Right, wherever it's convenient to throw a jack.
Anywhere.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And at the risk of actually, sounding critical, I mean, there's more than one way to skin a cat. But I think that some of the surge circuits strike me as that, where it feels like that anywhere that maybe it's almost like circuit bending level. It seems like anywhere that maybe you could do something with the signal, we might as well put a jack there,
Right.
And I try to be a bit more deliberate about the way that things work, and some of the circuits that are in the surge system can do 20 different things depending on how they're patched.
Right.
But the danger, I think, is that people won't really remember or understand how to make those patches, and then that gets in the way of the musicality.
Sure. Well, of the modules that you have out currently, I mean, you have what is, in essence, a pretty full voice of things. But the only thing I would say is there's not a very clear envelope system. But other than that, you have like a pretty full voice. Which of the current modules do you kind of consider like your baby? The thing that really represents your favorite circuit or your favorite design?
I think that position is shared by the voltage multi-stage and the harmonic oscillator. And the reason that in part, it's not a coincidence that those two circuits are ones that I'd done as Buchla format modules and then adapted into this line, because those are they're built on old ideas in a way, but they're ultimately like unique ideas in the way that they're presented, unique to my design.
Yeah, so, unique expressions, right?
And they're the most popular modules so far in the marketplace, in addition to being the ones that I'm the most invested in. So that's actually a payoff for me. But specifically the harmonic oscillator, it was there in the 60s. Buchla made an oscillator that used this wave folding technique to create all the harmonics from a trine, or in his case it was from a sawtooth core oscillator and then turned into a triangle and then folded across, and I'm using a triangle core. But that idea existed, but in the time that he did it, first of all, it wasn't possible to get the waves very pure because there's a lot of matching involved and a lot of mixing signals together, and they have to be scaled properly in order for the waveform purity to be any good. So I've worked on a few of that 148 oscillator, and it sounds kind of grainy and wavetabley. But but also that module had just CV in for the pitch, and then outputs for the harmonics, and that was it.
Oh.
And really what I brought to the table that I think makes it musical and makes it really useful is that all of the harmonic outputs are mixed with a voltage controlled mixer,
right,
with sliders so you can draw the mix, but also individual CV-ins for all of the harmonics, and then also controls where you can sweep across them in various ways and actually plug in some sort of external control voltage source and select individual harmonics, or open up a whole bunch of, sweep across them and open them up in a way almost like you would open up a low pass filter.
Right.
And some really interesting things happen that are a completely fresh. It's additive synthesis, but doing additive synthesis in analog is a fresh perspective on synthesis, and it's interesting because there's nothing to compare it to. So when I see people use that module for the first time, I usually see them walk up with some skepticism, and then there's a kind of eureka moment where they realize that there are things that they can do that there's never been a way to do before.
Right.
And get so excited and suddenly have a whole bunch of ideas. So that's really the reason that you make this stuff, is to try to inspire people to make music and to do something different than they've been doing over and over.
Well, absolutely. And I just think it's really exciting to see not only an opportunity to do some additive synth brought to the Euro table, but also have it be packaged in such a smart way. Because additive synthesis, there have been people that have tried to do it, but it's from a very digital standpoint. And I think to have this more pure analog pathway to attack it, but also one that has such a clear and straightforward presentation, does really open up some neat options. Well, we're just about at the end of our time here, and I wish we had more because I'd love to talk to you. I mean, one thing I'd like to know is, can you give us any hints about what the next things that might be coming from Verbos Electronics might be?
Well, I have a touchplate keyboard sitting on my workbench right now that is working. It has a couple of bugs that need to be ironed out, but that's right around the corner. And I'm working on a dedicated envelope generator that will have some quirks. I don't really want to do something that's like the rest of the pack. So
right.
I have a couple of ideas for how to make something that is a little bit special.
Sure.
And I'm, a couple of other ideas, but we'll let those come out naturally.
Sure. Good. Well, one of the things that when I told a couple of people that I was going to do an interview, a lot of questions were about the design work of your modules. So first of all, apparently there's quite a Twitter about where did you get those incredible knobs? Those are so cool. But everybody talks a lot about the graphic design and the physical design of the module faceplate. Did you do the graphic design, or did you work with someone else on that?
I did all the design of the modules themselves. Mm-hmm. I have a designer who did the logo, which doesn't appear on the modules, but is on the website and on all the letterhead and media and stuff.
Right.
So, no, I was a little bit reluctant to let go of the reins of the panel design, because I thought that was such an integral part of the designing of the module.
Right.
So if people like it, then that makes me extra happy.
Yeah, people are blown away by it. It's it really brought a level of. A lot of people talk about it as bringing a new level of graphic design to the module thing. So instead of everything looking sort of like grunge, meth addict, graphic design. This stuff is so classy and so beautiful. So congrats on that. That has caused quite a stir as well. So before we leave, there's a couple of things I want to raise. First of all, you talk about this kind of a string throughout your entire careers, and really since you were a teen, has been doing your own music. Are you still doing music?
I am. And actually, it's been a kind of interesting thing to... I think you said before that I was doing performances and have been doing that all along. But since I launched this product line, I've done a few performances using my synthesizer as the main instrument, and it's been kind of a rebooting of my operation as a musician to now kind of combine these forces together in an additional new way. And it's been pretty cool. I just came back on Sunday. I came back from Germany, and I was at the Music Messe trade show in Frankfurt, and then I was in Berlin for a week with doing an in-store and some demos for the people from Alex 4 and Schneidersladen. Mm-hmm. And I did a performance at the Arena Club in Berlin using this and some drawings. So yeah, still doing it.
Well, that's cool. Have you had any releases lately that you can share?
I haven't done any in the last 2 years. I haven't done any releases of my own.
You did some remixes, though, right?
Yeah, I've done lots of that kind of stuff, and produced bands. And there's a band called Minx that I produced this year. Last year, I guess, and ultimately it's kind of a one-man band. So I even, after the album was finished, I played keyboards in the band and went to Japan with them. So, wow. as a member of the band.
Right, awesome.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. And then one last thing. You are a self-made electronics guy to the point that you're doing this amazing work. And now some of that, it comes from, spending 20 years dedicating yourself, and some of it comes from spending time in the basement with Grant Richter. Not everybody has those opportunities. If someone wanted to get into synth design or module design or just musical electronics, what would you say kind of in the world of now would be a way to approach that?
It seems to me that now is a better time to learn this stuff than ever before. The thing is that if you would go to school for electrical engineering today, you wouldn't learn about any of this stuff. You'd learn more about programming. So, in a way, if music electronics or specifically analog synthesizers are your interest, it wouldn't actually even be something you could go to school for anymore. But with all of the kits and the community sort of crowdsourced projects that are out there now, it's a much safer world than it was 20 years ago, when this was kind of a deeply guarded black art where if you didn't meet somebody like Grant, then you would never actually get the information.
Right.
I mean, now it's all over the internet, and there are even new books about it. The books that I had when I was starting out were 20 years old at that point. But now there's, current information. There are people with blogs or with websites that are very supportive and really kind of give it all away. So it's really a good time to be an enthusiast, I think.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. Again, I have probably 2 hours more stuff I'd love to quiz you on. Thanks again for taking the time, and congratulations on not only getting the Verbos Electronics modules out, but congratulations on the tremendous amount of attention that you're getting for that. I hope those translate into a long history for your company.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, and we'll talk again soon.
Okay.
Well, on that one, you get to hear a little bit about my background as well. But I want to thank Mark for taking the time out of his schedule. He's busy building modules and developing new ones, so we definitely want to let him get back to work. But in the meantime, I want to thank all the listeners, all of the people that help support the podcast, and I hope that you'll tune in. If you want, go back and listen to some of the old ones. We're already putting together a really nice oral history of the whole art, music, and technology world. That was the point, and here we are. So go back and listen to some stuff, or if you didn't really catch everything on this one, go back and listen to this one too. It's great. I will see you guys next week. Thanks. Bye.